Since we're in Holy Week, we're going to do something we haven't done during Holy Week, during our Thursday study, and that is, of all things, talk about Easter. Woohoo! I'm going to ask a question before we're, not necessarily, we all know the Easter story. We all know what we could do is we could go into a very technical discussion of the variations of how Easter is presented. And we will do that just a slight bit. But essentially what I would like to do today is just more of a spiritual reflection about the story that's related to us in Scripture. And that is the through line for today's discussion is what Easter means to you, because it is the core element of our faith. There have been many, many, many great teachers in the world. And all of them teach essentially the same message. And there are many people who respect a great deal the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. But when it comes to this notion of the, as we talked about when we were talking about Mark's Gospel a couple of years ago, this notion of the theos aner, the God-man, or the incarnation, as we've been really sort of hitting with John's Gospel in the past year, or now, in the year of Matthew in year A, when, in the cycle of the lectionary, when we're talking about the King of Kings, this notion of the Messiah, the Son of David, this whole notion that it's almost a step too far for most people, because that is the critical question of faith. And the proverbial leap of faith that thinkers like Kierkegaard and others talk about, where you can only come so far by reason, and then there is this notion that you're presented with all of the realities, and then there comes a moment in human thinking and human life where you're confronted with it all and you have to make a decision. And that decision is a decision where you have to say, I believe. Now, it does not mean that faith is based on no reason at all, quite the contrary. C.S. Lewis, who, a great thinker, and I love C.S. Lewis for this very reason. C.S. Lewis himself was, for most of his adult life, pretty much an agnostic. And an agnostic is not someone who doesn't believe. An agnostic is someone who goes through life and says, basically, I don't know. It's a position that says, I still could be shown. And he did come to a point in life, and interesting when you look at his biography and you look at his writings, that he inched ever closer to that. If you want to think of it as a precipice or a cliff, he inched ever closer to it, and he finally looked over it, and he would take what the existentialists call that leap of faith. And it is that notion that finally we come to some point in life where we finally say, yes, I believe. And once we do that, if it's a genuine leap of faith, there is no going back. I mean, otherwise it's not a leap of faith, because the idea is if you can go back, you never really stepped off into the abyss. Because if you're not, into the abyss, you're still holding on to what was behind you. The abyss, though, of faith is not without reference point. That's what I'm saying. It isn't like faith. A lot of people of more skeptical mindset, or perhaps people, scientists and so on, that may be skeptics, would say, oh, faith is useless because it is not based in reality. That's not true. Thomistic theologians, for example, would always say there's a mistake that's often made by those classical theologians that are called the scholastic, Thomistic or neo-Thomists in the more modern terminology, where Thomas Aquinas, one of the more, I was named after him, very, prodigious theologian of the Middle Ages, was one who analyzed just about everything, and using Aristotelian philosophy, which is a philosophy very much grounded in the hardscape of life. In other words, in the things that you can sense and taste and touch and feel, undertook this vast project, essentially, of proving the existence of God. And I mean, I'm really distilling this down to, into a nutshell, which is, I mean, this is, his Summa Theologica is like, volumes and volumes and volumes and volumes. But he did this in such a way where he gets to a point even where it's almost like the amount of data or the amount of information that he amasses almost is so and that's his point, is so overwhelming that you cannot not believe. But he says ultimately there's that little bit left where it is, it is the modicum of faith that you need to make that final decision. And it's in the principle of first causes. In other words, for example, we can talk about, cosmologists today. You hear people talk about the Big Bang Theory. Where does the universe come from? And we, Kathy, you're the nuclear physicist among us here. We can go back and where's the origin of the universe, and we can compress the universe down to this little tiny little thing. Well, and all came from that. Okay, fine, that's all well and good. Well, where did that come from? It's like, it's like, so it's in Thomistic theory, it's called the principle of first causes. That ultimately it had to come from somewhere or something. And so what is that? And we don't know. And there's no way for the human mind to comprehend it. And it is ultimately in Thomistic thinking, that principle of first causes is God. So that, that thing which is beyond our comprehension is God. And when I started studying theology, we talked about immanence and transcendence and all this kind of stuff. The idea is God is both immanent. In other words, we can know God by our sensate life. We can look at the universe. We can look at the intricacies of a leaf. We can look at the gorgeous beauty of a sunrise, or the vastness of the universe, or whatever just floats your boat in that sense of being struck by awe, and we can see, we can sense God. That's what we consider immanence. But then there's transcendence. There's always something more beyond that is beyond our comprehension, beyond our imagining. And God is both at the same time. And that's where we run into trouble with our own human skepticism, because we cannot imagine that. It's beyond, that's just that by definition, it's beyond our imagining. So when we get to this point where we start talking about the resurrection, this is beyond our imagining. This is why when we talked about the resurrection, or wrong one, the resuscitation, I'll use that term, of Lazarus 2 weeks ago, I made a very big point about the fact that Lazarus did not experience the resurrection. Lazarus experienced the giving of life again, that Lazarus was brought back to life from the dead, which is a different experience than what Jesus experienced in the resurrection. That what Jesus experienced in the resurrection as a human being, the human nature of Jesus, was a totally different reality. And it is beyond our imagining. And it is beyond our imagining because it is prefigured for us in the scriptures, in the mystery of the transfiguration. If we go back into our scriptural imagery, we go back to the transfiguration. If you remember that story where the three of Jesus' closest disciples, they go up to Mount Tabor, and suddenly Jesus is, clothed in white, and Moses and Elijah are with him, and so on. And Peter says, "Oh, I'll build 3 tabernacles." Remember that story. So, that was a prefigurement. It wasn't the full revelation of it, but it was a sort of preface, sort of coming attractions, so to speak. And then what happens then after the crucifixion is Jesus is laid in the tomb, and Jesus is dead, dead, dead. Again, the 3 days. And that Jesus is totally transfigured. And there's that term again, that there's a transfiguration, that Jesus is changed. Jesus' nature is changed, but Jesus is not simply, he didn't leave his human nature behind and only his godness came out of the tomb, but rather his human nature and his divine nature still together, still, unified, because you cannot separate them, was totally transfigured into this new reality that we cannot imagine, which is why the stories are told, particularly in the Gospel of John, and we will hear them through the Easter season, where Jesus appears to the disciples and he is still a human being. He eats and even says, I'm not a ghost. I'm eating with you. Ghosts don't eat. But he appears to them in the upper room through locked doors. Now we associate that with spiritual beings that are not confined by the physical confines of locked doors or walls. So what's being done there is that the gospel writers are trying to paint this picture of this new kind of existence, a new kind of existence that knows not the limitations of this life as we know it, but it is still human. It is still divine. And what St. Paul goes on to describe later on is his insight, and we hear it in our liturgy, as he lives in us and we in him, that we begin to share that life in this life, but we only begin to do it now, so that what we experience with our death is the beginning. So our imagery, for example, in our funeral liturgies, is that this is not the end of anything. In fact, it is the end of the beginning. Does that make sense? So that, like Jesus' death on the cross is the end of the beginning of this process for Jesus of Nazareth. And then what happens is the resurrection. And so when we just had the dialogue between Martha and Jesus, when he says, do you believe this? And Martha says, yes, Lord, I believe this on the resurrection on the last day. I will, and so the whole idea, when at the end of the creed, I believe in the resurrection of the dead. When we say things like that, this is what we're talking about. Is that we believe that our life is not some sort of ghostly existence, that our spirits float around someplace, but rather there is this existence that supersedes space and time, which is beyond our imagining and beyond the limitations of this 3D world of ours, and lives in the realm of God, which is in the realm of that, to go back to Thomas, in the realm of the first cause. Now that'll blow your mind. But that's what we celebrate at Easter. That's what we celebrate at the resurrection. And so these images that we get of the scriptural images are human beings trying to relate this in story form to an ancient people who try to communicate meaning through stories.
One of the things that I struggled with in medicine was to deal with people in such a way that I never removed hope. And I think we are in that bind with what we're talking about, in that ultimately the message is you have hope waiting for you there. And you don't understand it. Nobody understands it. Nobody knows where life came from. Nobody knows where all the energy came from to create all the mass that occurred way back when some explosion occurred. But there's a message there for us, that for us, there is hope.
There was a wonderful image that I saw once. It was a little video that somebody put together. I went to look for it one day, and I just can't find it. I don't even know how to find it. So it was one of those things that comes along, in life, and you see it and it makes an impression on you. And what it was somebody's reflection on conception and the chemical interactions that are happening. And having been a furtive chemist at one point in my life, and knowing what chemical interactions are, they're an exchange of energies. And what it was sort of an artistic rendition of it, where sparks represent the exchange of energy. And it was, as the actual sort of biological thing happens relative to sperm and egg and all that sort of thing. And then the chromosomes start to unite and all of that sort of thing, that, all of a sudden the sparks started to fly, and you begin to see this tremendous amount of energy happening. And it's all happening without anybody being aware that it's happening. That was the message that was being communicated in this little artistic rendition of it, because it's happening deep within the womb of someone. And, it's just, when it happens, most people don't know that it's happening, but, that amount of energy that it's being, Kathy, we go back to your physics thing, when, it's not exactly like fusion where, you get that, you get two atoms that come together, if it's nuclear fusion, you're going to have like, you're going to have more energy than you need to know what to do with. But, it's essentially like that in the sense that, you've got all this, when you got putting atoms and molecules together, you have all this energy that starts to fly around. It's like it's just amazing to me that these things happen on a daily basis, even inside of us, and we are unaware. And so that when we stop to think about, we want to think about, something like the resurrection, the Shroud of Turin, let's put that aside. Is it fake? Is it real? I don't care. It doesn't matter. It's kind of like Lourdes. If you watch, the Song of Bernadette, which as a good Catholic boy, way back when, we were sort of almost required. That was required watching. I was a boy when it came out, so we all trekked off, as second graders to the theater to watch it. And but at the end, there's a wonderful little phrase there. It says, "For those who have faith." No, for those who have no faith, no explanation is possible. For those who have faith, none is necessary. That's true about just about everything, isn't that? Really? So when you start talking about this notion of the resurrection, that goes back to our sort of original conversation about belief, is you cannot compel someone to believe, because it ultimately comes down to the will to believe, to the decision to believe. You can amass all of the argumentation you want and place it in front of somebody, and they can stare at it for year upon year upon year. But until there is something in the internal construction of that individual that will compel them to believe, they will not believe. And the operative word there is will. Sometimes it's tragedy. Sometimes it's the exact opposite of tragedy. It's the operation of sheer beauty and awe and joy. It can be either or. It doesn't matter. With God, there is no value orientation to that. There is no positive or negative about that. In one sense, the answer to that, what does it take, is whatever it takes. So when it comes to this notion of the resurrection and this question of Easter, we who are believers can shake our heads and say, how can you not believe? Well, I just offer that sentence from the end of that story, the Song of Bernadette. Because sometimes, it's a little frustrating as a minister of the gospel when we put all this energy into these, for example, these services of Holy Week. And, yesterday during Tenebrae, those of you who were there, right in the middle of one of the periods of silence, you hear the motorcycles running by. Like the world doesn't care. You know what? The world doesn't care. That's exactly the point. And then I am put back into my meditation of, when Jesus was walking down the streets of Jerusalem, we too often have the image of Cecil B. DeMille, him for a moment. It probably wasn't even him. But, this notion that all the crowds of Jerusalem came out, they probably didn't even notice what was going on. Oh, there were probably some crowds there, but not the whole city. Part of that comes from the Gospels. Who wrote the Gospel? the followers of Jesus. So they're going to want to say, you crazy people, this is right in front of you. Why didn't you see it? So they're going to say, they're going to strengthen their arguments. They're going to make it seem as obvious as possible and so on. Where, more than likely, they all saw this as one more idiotic, false prophet going, most of them,
Lunatic.
yeah, most people, just were worried about putting food on the table. They weren't worried about who's preaching to whom and what's going on here and what's going on there. Look at, not to, bring up crazy things, but it's like just what happened a couple days ago in New York City. Everybody's, oh, big crowds are gonna be, whether you're for or against, the former president, how many people were there? Probably 1,000, if that many. Most of New York City just went on about their business. Wall Street had to do its thing, and Madison Avenue had to do its thing, and Park Avenue had to do its thing, and the people in Brooklyn were frying onions and potatoes, and it's just the way of life. You don't stop everything for because some egotistical person thinks that they're the center of the universe, or some crowd think, or I'm not picking on him indirectly, but or some crowd thinks that their leader, this Jesus from Nazareth, is the center of the universe. In hindsight, maybe we would like to think it's so. And so we paint this picture. And then, of course, as a quote unquote Christian culture, we make movies and art and all this kind of stuff. And so, we have all of this stuff. Probably there were some people, it's the Stations of the Cross kind of phenomena. You go to the Holy Land today and you make the Stations of the Cross, you go to the Via Dolorosa. Yeah, there are a lot of crowds there, but there's an awful lot of other people who pay no attention to it at all, when you stop to think about it. Not because they're disrespectful, not because they don't care. I mean, in the sense that they have no faith, but it means nothing to them. And in our day and age, it's even more so. I mean, I've stood outside our church, on Good Friday, and, back in the day, and I've heard people bemoan this, the banks would close at noon and stayed closed until 3 o'clock on Good Friday, and the stores would close and all this kind of stuff. And where did those people go? They weren't in church. I don't remember the churches being packed to the gills. The blue laws on Sunday, remember those? Yeah, there were more people in church, to be sure, because there was nothing else to do. But they certainly, when you stop to think how many people lived in a particular town, I lived in a small town of 5,000 people. I can guarantee you in all the churches in Albion, there were not 5,000 people. Even though every store in town was closed. It doesn't matter, and that's why all of that stuff fell away, was because it didn't mean anything to anybody. We who follow Jesus, we who follow the way, don't want to admit that, though. And so we who are left as sort of what we consider the rump of the faithful, the sort of, I don't know, bunch that maybe, are the ones who still are around. And I did those of you who are Judith and Therese, when I first came to St. Luke's as the interim, we did some visioning work. And one of the things I did was a study of statistics from the parish. And it was 5, 15, 25, and 50 years. And adjusting stewardship dollars for inflation and looking at church attendance, because everybody was saying, oh, we're dying, we're dying, we're dying. We're going broke. We don't have any people in church, blah, blah, blah. We found that basically there was a straight line across that. The only variable was there were less people in church. And that could be explained by all the things I just mentioned. That people were going to church for very different reasons. Because basically the people who were going to church now were the ones who were deeply committed. But they were the people who were going to church before who were deeply committed. The people who were not deeply committed were not the ones who were sustaining the mission of the church. They were going to church because that's where you got your business. That's where you got your clients. There was nothing else to do on Sunday morning, that sort of thing.
And you were highly looked down upon if you did not go to church.
Right. It was socially necessary. Your neighbors were looking at you askance because you didn't go to church. Those kinds of things. So that's what we found out. And when you really look at the careful sociological studies about that, it was always thus. There's a small group of committed people who are the core of the church, and that's always been that way. So we're actually probably more honestly the church today than we have been in the last 100 years. And that's a good thing. Not a bad thing, it's a good thing. But it also means we have to be more completely the church. That's kind of what I was talking about on Sunday, but that's not Kathy.
I was going to add something else too, that a lot of people, even though they don't go to church, a lot of them, there's still a lot of good being done by these people, and a lot of them very strongly believe. Look at all the charities that we have now for, tornadoes, helping Ukraine, helping at the border, just trying to give people a chance at a better life.
Well,
that we didn't even hear about.
Philanthropy and religion are not the same thing.
That is true, but I think a lot of people, they have it in their hearts.
Yes.
It may not be a formal belief in God, but I think some of it is the goodness, and there's something in their heart that a lot of people do believe, but they just don't want to be in church.
Well, they don't have to be in church.
Well, they don't have to. And, you hear so much bad stuff about church.
Well, there's a difference between organized, there's the whole nuns controversy, NONES, are you spiritual but not religious? I don't think that's a possibility, quite frankly, from a Christian point of view, because being part of a community is, Jesus said it, you are part of my body. But the problem is the institutional church. The institutionalism is a different thing. Community and institutionalism, when we conflate those two things, yes, we got a problem. And I think when a lot of institutions have put themselves in an awkward place because they have become exclusivist. Their worry is very much like the Pharisees' worry in Jesus' time, and that's why I rail against it so much, is that their job is about, they've created a job in their mindset about excluding people rather than making themselves inclusive. Not calling people to the center of life, but rather keeping people out. And, purity tests, litmus tests, those kinds of things. And that's why the Episcopal Church is, and a little commercial to be frank, that's why the Episcopal Church has such a hard time, because our penchant is tribalism in our culture right now. It's like who's in and who's out, and it's always been that way in American culture. So it's just stronger now than it has been in a long time. So we want to make sure everybody is pure. It was ever thus, but never true. So that's why our religious system in the Episcopal Church is pretty basic. The 7 historical councils, the creeds, and that's basically all you have to believe. And other than that, we can all get together, have various belief systems, and still eat at the same table, profess the same faith, one Lord, one faith, one baptism. Basically, Jesus is both human and divine. When I say the 7 historical councils, that's what we're talking about. And that Jesus is God and man, that's what we're saying. And that Jesus died on the cross and rose from the dead, which is what we're celebrating. And that, and we believe in a sacramental system that God speaks to us through the sentient world. Those are the basic things. And if we can ascribe ourselves to those things, we can live together and then work together for the sake of the dignity and peace of the world. That's Episcopalianism in a nutshell. Anyway, let's read some scripture.
Oh, good.
All right. Here we go. Should take, there's Easter Day, yay! And this, we're going to use John's, I think we're using John on Sunday, yes. We're using Matthew on the Easter Vigil, but we're using John on Sunday. John, early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the tomb. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved. Do you notice that phrase, the one whom Jesus loved? Hold that marker in your mind. And said to them, they have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him. Then Peter and the other disciple set out, and they went to the tomb. The two were running together, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent down to look in and saw the linen wrappings lying there, but he did not go in. Then Simon Peter came in following him and went into the tomb. He saw the linen wrappings lying there and the cloth that had been on Jesus' head, not lying with the linen wrappings, but rolled up in a place by itself. Then the other disciple who reached the tomb first also went in, and he saw and believed. For as yet they did not understand the scripture, that he must rise from the dead. Then the disciples returned to their homes. But Mary stood weeping outside the tomb. And as she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb. She saw the two angels standing in white, sitting, she saw the two angels in white sitting where the body of Jesus had been lying, one at the head and the other at the feet. And they said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" She said to them, "They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." When she said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus then said to her, Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you looking for?" And supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you've laid him, and I will take him away." And then Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned and said to him in Hebrew, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said to her, "Do not hold on to me, because I have not yet ascended to the Father. But go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and to your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene went and announced to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord." And she told them that he had said these things to her. Here ends the lesson. What is interesting in that lesson to you?
That Mary is the first one to actually see and talk with Jesus, and he hasn't even ascended yet. But he chose not to be seen by the other two disciples.
Aha. Why is that significant, do you think? Why is it special to you?
Because the disciples often have, at least some of them more than others, have quite a bit of ego. And Mary doesn't seem to have that. I always like to see when ego is not rewarded.
Yes, excellent. Good, good.
It's interesting that she sees him at first and doesn't recognize him until he says her name. That first he says, "Woman,
Mhm,
why are you weeping?" And then
mhm.
then he moves to Mary, and then she recognizes him. And it's kind of like this, I guess you call it, the scales have been removed from her eyes, or
Mhm.
at his will, that
There's relationship.
yeah.
It reminds me, Kathy, when you said that, of Isaiah 43. I have called you by name and you are mine. And saying her name opens
Yeah,
eyes.
a name is a powerful tool.
Mhm.
Well, and there's something about this used to really struck me when I was a child and I would hear the scripture, and the idea that Jesus's followers so often did not recognize him after his death. Um, it, it was it sort of reminded me of those old Greek myths where one of the gods would disguise himself and come back to earth and see how people would treat him. That's the first kind of connection that I made with that when I first heard those scriptures. And it just still strikes me today that he came in some form that at first would not be recognizable to others, but then eventually they would. And like you said, calling the name seemed to have a lot to do with it. I guess that happens with doubting Thomas too.
Mhm.
Well, Jesus probably would have had some familiarity with the Greek methods of teaching.
Mhm. Or
Because that,
could it also be this notion that he's dead? How could it be that he was alive?
From beginning to end, everything is shrouded in mystery. Because
Mm,
Mary goes there and there's an empty tomb and there's really no one to talk to. So she runs to the disciples and they come and there's nobody there and they go away. And then she sees the angels and tell her, don't look for him here. And then she doesn't recognize. There is mystery shrouding everything in that reading, until Jesus acknowledges, reveals himself to Mary, and then he gives her specific pieces of information.
you just,
Mary is special.
well, yes, of course.
Mary is special to him. And she deserves to know. And the rest will come. But for her, he has given her the message that he is alive. And what better thing could you do for your mother?
No, that's not the Mary, though. That's not the Mary.
Oh, that's a different Mary. Okay.
Yeah, yeah,
This
this is a different Mary. This is Mary, the disciple.
Ah,
but
I
she's
take it
still
all
very,
back.
but she's, no, George, you're right. She's still a very special person in his life.
Yes.
Absolutely.
You know, if you, one of my favorite things is Jesus Christ Superstar. Well, John Legend is John, you know, I just love John Legend.
How to love him.
Yeah, that, but she's such, and you know, in there she's has a prominent role, but she's portrayed as being such a calming influence on, and kind of like his sanctuary.
Yes,
And as a human being, we all need that.
yes.
And you know, wouldn't surprise me if that was not her role.
Yes.
And that makes her very special.
Judith hit on something, though. The word was reveal. It is Jesus who reveals himself. Yeah, Therese said earlier, first it was woman, and then it was Mary. And so Jesus took it upon himself to do what was necessary to reveal whom he was to her. It's also very interesting that you hit on this notion of the name. That's another very important issue here, because naming things in the ancient world, it goes all the way back to Genesis. That naming means having control. Not control in the sense of but naming dominion is the old-fashioned word, having dominion. So when you name a child, it's very important to have the capacity to name a child. So for example, at least we don't do this in the Episcopal Church, but in the Roman Church, the first question at a baptism, for example, I used to ask, and what name do you give this child? And the only person who has the authority to do that is the parent, or the person who has the role of a parent. Somebody who has authority over the parent. And so the very fact that Jesus exercises that role, Mary. See, if he were the gardener, woman would be the appropriate vocative, because he would have no authority over her. But Mary is, and remember I said relationship. There's relationship here. And again, you didn't quite hit on it yet, but notice that it's the woman, well, you did sort of, it's the woman who is the first. And all through all of the Gospels,
The woman is first.
the women are being raised up. And this is an issue in the early church. We don't see it as an issue, quote, air quotes around that, until we get into the Pauline letters and so on. But the role of women in the church, we see it come, very explicitly in Corinthians, the whole issue of, wearing something in your head and all that kind of stuff, all of that, because there now is this issue of the equality, in Galatians, where Paul says it very explicitly. There is no Jew or Greek, male or female. He just comes out and says it. There is no distinction in Christ. Everyone is equal in Christ. That is not true in that society, either Jewish society or Gentile society. This is a countercultural movement. And it has its roots in the very teachings of Jesus himself. We go back, in our Lenten readings, go back to the discussion, with the woman at the well. The very fact, again, she was a Samaritan. Well, that's bad enough. Not only was she a Samaritan, she was a Samaritan woman. Bad enough. She was a Samaritan woman who had had 5 husbands. And her current husband wasn't even married to her. It's like, when you get all of that sort of stuff lined up, Jesus is doing a pretty countercultural thing here. And so in where Jesus appears first to the woman. And so what happens? The women go back to the men. And so what do the men do? Oh, you histrionic women.
Yeah.
I can't be right. I have to see
What
for
do they
myself.
know?
Gotta go see
Yeah.
for myself. So Peter and John, among Jesus' closest, again, remember I said, put a marker here, put your thumb in that thing. The phrase, the disciple whom Jesus loved. We've heard this phrase many times. Who is this? Allegedly.
John.
John, the one who's writing this gospel.
Allegedly.
Who we
The
think
beloved disciple.
probably the youngest, right?
Yeah, theoretically, the scholars, pretty much think, of course, there are those who dispute it, but that it traditionally is John the Beloved. To the point where Raymond Brown, one of the foremost Johannine scholars, wrote a wonderful book called The Community of the Beloved Disciple, and how there was a whole following around the Johannine way of thinking about Jesus. The Gospel of John, and then we look at the 3 letters of John, and how it has a slightly different take on the way of Jesus. A little bit, when we look at from I'm going to show my Episcopalian bias here. When we look at what our presiding bishop, the whole way of love thing that he's been promulgating since he became presiding bishop, that's really the way of John. That's the Johannine beloved disciple way, is this notion of love, because that's the through arc of the Johannine corpus. I mean, hear it my preaching a lot too. It's the notion of the self-giving Jesus. That the idea that the greatest, there is no greater love hath one than one gives one's life for one's friends. That's straight out of John. And we'll hear it tonight at Maundy Thursday. There is no, for example, in John's gospel, there is no Eucharistic discourse. I just take it back. That's the wrong thing. There is no Eucharistic narrative. There is no on the night before he died, he took bread and so on. You get that in the other gospels. You do not get that in John. John's theory and thesis on the Eucharist comes in John 6, which is based in the feeding of the 5,000. We do not get the Last Supper is all about service and about love and about self-giving. And interestingly, the ancient tradition of the church is that that's the gospel we read on Maundy Thursday. So that the core of the church's communal life is based not only on the sharing of the agape meal, in other words, the breaking of the bread and so on, but that the core of it is the mutual service of one another. So the two have to go together. Too often, though, however, we sort of bifurcate them. So this day we celebrate it, and we celebrate it to remind ourselves that we can never separate them. So when you've heard us talk about atonement theology and incarnational theology, this again is another one of those reminders that those two things have to go hand in hand. Too often we have this whole emphasis on Good Friday and the atonement of the cross.
Mm-hmm.
But you don't get Good Friday without Maundy Thursday. A little bit of a reminder from the importance of our liturgical theology. The liturgy that begins this evening doesn't end until the dismissal at the Easter Vigil, at the Great Vigil. If you look at the prayer book liturgies of the 3 major branches of the liturgical churches, there's a greeting and an opening tonight. There's no dismissal tonight. There's no opening or dismissal on Good Friday. There's no opening on the Great Vigil. There's a blessing, there's a benediction and dismissal only at the Great Vigil. So there's 3 days, 1 liturgy. That's why it's called the Sacred Triduum, 3 days. So it's 1 consecutive liturgy. And if you think of it that way, then you begin to see that it's the story arc of it also. So we gather this evening and we remember the Last Supper of Jesus with the disciples, the washing of the feet, the mandatum, hence we call it Maundy Thursday. The command, love one another as I have loved you. And then there's the betrayal, the darkness, the descent into darkness, the garden vigil and all that sort of thing, if you want to observe that. And then the issues of Good Friday, the quote unquote celebrations we call it, or commemoration, we prefer that term, the commemoration of the Passion on Good Friday, and then the emptiness of the Holy Saturday. And then once sunset comes, then the celebrations of the Easter Vigil, the blessing of the fire, the Easter candle, the lessons that we listen to and so on, salvation history, and then the proclamation of Easter. And the first Eucharist of Easter is actually then. That's proclamation of Easter is actually the Great Vigil. Easter Sunday is an afterthought.
Hmm.
Because it's already Sunday. By the way, again, the way we tell time in the church, sundown begins the day. So we've already started Easter at 7:30 on Saturday. So what else on this gospel? John's gospel on Sunday morning. Anything else in there?
Well, Jesus told Mary not to touch her because he had not ascended.
That's an interesting thing. I've always puzzled.
Yeah, I'm not sure why, but
Because we think of ascension, we think of the more classic ascension,
yeah, the going
Mount
up.
Tabor, bye-bye, see you later.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I, from a theological point of view, I think there's this, the way that I've heard it explained, and I really haven't done a lot of work on that. And one of these days I might, maybe when I'm on sabbatical, I'll have time to go and dig into the Cambridge libraries or something. But this idea of the finalization of this transformation or this transfiguration of the total of being seated at the right hand of the Father, the completion of that dynamic. And then because it's in John's gospel that it's not like he ascends to the Father never to return, like in Acts, like in Luke's narrative, because he comes back. I mean, he's at the seashore in Tiberias. That's where he has his dialogue with Peter, and the whole dialogue with Thomas. Here, see my hands, see my side. So there must be something there, and I'm not quite sure what that is, but it is intriguing, and that's part of that mysterious thing going on.
And you don't hear it talked about.
Yeah, it's kind of like Mary interrupted something.
Yeah.
Hey, hold on here. I gotta go see Daddy for a bit. I'll be back. I'll see you later. But in the meantime, I just wanted you to know everything's just fine.
Yeah. That could very well be the reason that the process was not complete yet.
Yeah, there's a lovely, actually, if I can bring it up real quick, one of the pictures in, not pictures, one of the windows in the church at St. Mark's, it's a Tiffany window, is called Nolo Tangere, which is don't touch me. It's the scene from the gospel. I don't know if I can find it real. I don't want to keep you from that. I don't know where I put them. Real quick, find them. I should have looked this up before because I knew we were going to talk about this gospel. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing. It's actually, when you look at Jesus, you go like, who is that? It's a very different portrayal. it is. Okay, good. Um, here, share this with you just because it's just so pretty. Just to download for a sec. Oh, here it is. It's almost like there, there, and this is very much a Tiffany window. Can you see it? What we're looking- Because, and this is you can actually touch it because it's at floor level. It's curtain glass, so you can, the folds in the garment. It's not the best picture because it's backlit a little bit too much exposure. Maybe there's a better one here. Hold on. The folds in the garments and so on are just really magnificent. At first, when I first saw it, I thought that was an image of a woman. I thought it was the other way around. I thought that was Mary. It's not. That's Jesus. And that's the pulpit desk in the way, unfortunately. Really just marvelous. So just wanted to share that with you. Any questions about this particular thing? So I'm going to ask the final question. What does Easter mean to you? Not bunnies and chocolate. No bunnies. Bunnies aren't allowed.
It's that new beginning, that opportunity to renew our faith as to what we really believe as Christians. It's sort of an impetus. It reminds us we go from the lows of Good Friday to the highs of Easter and the resurrection, and it's like a chance to make a new commitment.
Mm-hmm. Excellent.
It's a completion of the messianic message, and now we're free. The whole Bible has been building up to this.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, it's the culmination of everything we think we believe in and now being expressed for us. And as I mentioned before, gives us all the ultimate hope of why we're here.
Okay. Judith, do you have anything or?
I don't know. I don't know.
Okay.
The same as everybody else, or I don't know. I do think in some ways it is, like somebody said, a new beginning, because after we go through the season of Easter, we are going back to revisiting the life of Christ and his message. So it's kind of an end of a story overlapping the beginning of the story. But I can't be any more specific than what anybody else said.
Yeah. To me, it's I've said this before. I think I love from artistic point of view, I love Zeffirelli's Jesus of Nazareth, his movie.
Yes.
And at the very end, there's a non-biblical character. His name is Zerah. He's sort of the Deus ex machina in a way. You know, he's always sort of around. He's sort of a prototype of one of the scribes. And at the very end, they're all sort of, you know, the body is gone. The disciples are dispersed because they're all dither because, you know, and I forgot who it is exactly. I'd have to look at it at the scene again, but they're all saying, well, that's over with now, you know, at least it's done. And he looks at the camera and he says, now it begins. It all begins. And that's the end of the movie.
It isn't over, it is just the beginning.
It's just the beginning, you know. He says, in other words, he gets it. He's telling them, you have no idea what you just did, you know. And I think that is exactly true if we allow the power. If we allow the power.
It's, I
to
always
take-
like that about that movie because it's, everybody says, you know, like the Roman and the Pharisees, whatever. Well, that's taken care of. And
Yep.
it's like, no, it is only beginning. You have no idea. And
And, you know, and that was part of what, you know, what really, you know, for those of you who've heard the sermon on Sunday, that's really what was underneath that. While I, you know, spoke so fervently about the issue, which I still believe, and I still am very upset by the violence and the whole issue of gun violence and so on in our society. And that's why I'm so animated about it, because the power that we have is a tremendous power if we would allow it to operate. But the operative power in our lives, unfortunately, is fear. And too often, not fear of the guns, but fear of one another. And if we would simply allow the power of God to be made manifest in us, I think we would have the power to do something. We would do marvelous things. We always have. And sometimes it can be hard. You know, it was hard for Jesus. We look at our history, we can go back and look at the civil rights movement. In my own life, I look at the whole movement of LGBTQ inclusion. I mean, I was part of that struggle. I'm seeing that being, you know, peeled back. And I'm very upset about that. You know, I'm going like, okay, well, now in my senior years, am I going to get re-engaged by that? And I'm glad to see some younger sort of people in a reasonable way taking up that cause and saying, no, let's not do this. And I think these are the things that Jesus came to proclaim. And that's why I said, we can say it's all for naught. There's nothing we can do about it. And that's why at the end of it, as George said, I think there's always hope. You know, that's why I said, you know, that the concluding part of that talk was, but you and I know. And if we have this knowledge, then the only things that's keeping us from changing things is our own determination to do so. And so the Easter, the knowledge of the resurrection, the knowledge of this hope the reality of it in our lives is the capacity to make this real. And it's up to us. It's that simple. But that's that leap, that's why I kind of started with that notion of the leap of faith. It's, we can be confronted with the reality, but until we actually make that step, and that step is hard, very hard, I know. But sometimes we have to make it. Sometimes the consequences are difficult. And sometimes we don't want to face those consequences. And that's everybody's individual decision. But we have to do so prayerfully, reasonably, and in prayerful discernment. And without judgment, and always, with respect for one another. And with that said, I have to leave because my other half is probably having surgery at this moment.
Oh, they did it? Oh, good.
Well, he was scheduled to go in at 11.
Mhm.
He has a kidney stone, and it's an
Yeah.
emergency situation. And he said, do your Bible study. So I'm going to go over to Community General, use my license to get in, which I did after Tenebrae. I had to go to security. Got a minister here, getting so I will be leaving shortly to go and see where he's at. So